And joining me now is former White House counsel John Dean, former State Department spokesman Nayyera Haq, former CIA analyst Navel Bakos, Navel Jamali, MSNBC contributor and author of How to Catch a Russian Spy, Malcolm Nance, MSNBC contributor and author of The Plot to Hack America. A mega panel, as it were, to discuss these issues. But I'm going to start here at the table with you, John Dean, because the bombshell news that Michael Flynn wants immunity. You have been down this road before, sir, in the Watergate hearings. Explain to us the difference between the kind of immunity you can get from Congress, from one of those committees, and the kind of immunity you could get from prosecution.
I was actually involved in the writing of the statute even before I ever needed it for myself.
Yeah.
Two types of immunity. One is called transactional, which really takes care of any kind of very broad. The other is use immunity. This is what Congress typically grants, is use immunity, which is just for the testimony you give before Congress. In other words, you can still be prosecuted if they have evidence that's outside of that, or evidence they've collected before you testify. So it's a rather limited situation. The FBI cannot grant immunity. It has to come from the Department of Justice.
Right.
If a committee of Congress wants to grant the immunity, they have to wait a 60-day period to get clearance from Justice, and then a judge approves it before it goes forward. They do not give immunity unless they're really getting something for it.
Right. And can you be compelled to testify before Congress even without immunity? Can you be made to testify? You
cannot be made. You can always take the Fifth Amendment.
Right.
And if you take that and the Congress wants your testimony, they say, we're going to immunize you and force you to testify. So yes, they can.
Right.
But they typically know a lot about the case. The case has progressed pretty far by then.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
they can force it, and again, it's just use immunity, but they can compel testimony.
And one last question that we know in the Iran-Contra case, you had Oliver North get immunity, testify, but then he was prosecuted anyway. It's a similar situation to what you faced, but then he had his conviction overturned.
Right.
Is that because the immunity turned out to have covered the things that he was prosecuted for?
No, what happened is the court said you can't have it both ways. You can't force a person to testify, which they did in North's case, and then turn around and prosecute him on the same evidence, because what you've done is you've tainted the jury pool.
Right.
You've affected people when you have this high-profile hearing, which North certainly was, and then the jury pool could not really say they had not been influenced by that testimony. So it's not clean testimony.
Yeah.
So that's how that was the exception. That really has never been dealt with above Oliver North's case.
Yeah.
It hasn't been solved yet.
Because that testimony was public, it was on TV, it was hard not to see it. Let's go and talk a little bit about Michael Flynn and sort of draw this out a little bit, and this Devin Cohen-Watnick, who is the tie between Michael Flynn and this information that was handed over to Devin Nunes. Malcolm, you had a political story back in earlier this month that talked about the fact that when Mike Flynn was pushed out as National Security Advisor, his successor, H.R. McMaster, wanted to pick his own people. But one of the things he wanted to do was to get rid of this guy, Devin Cohen-Watnick, who came over from the Defense Intelligence Agency with Flynn, but he wasn't able to. Trump overruled him after Ezra Cohen-Watnick, after Watnick actually went to Donald Trump and to his friend Jared Kushner to keep his job. What do we know, if anything, about the relationship between Ezra Cohen-Watnick at DIA and Michael Flynn?
Well, not a lot, and I've spoken to some very, very senior DIA people, and just recently, a senior Special Forces guy who worked directly for Michael Flynn. But Flynn had a reputation there of being rather iffy and choosing favorites. So obviously, Cohen-Watnick came over with him to the White House. And the very fact that Cohen-Watnick, who is an extremely junior person, this is a guy who should be standing watch at an operational watch center with a cup of, with a pot of coffee, pouring coffee for other people. How he got to the White House with Flynn shows that he's a Flynn loyalist. And clearly, when Flynn left, he was left behind, and he was put in charge of analysis for all of the National Security Council's intelligence. And if General McMaster couldn't get him out because he went and directly appealed to Jared Kushner, Steve Bannon, who took his case to Donald Trump personally and overrode General McMaster, then this guy is buried in there for a reason other than the fact that he has no intelligence background whatsoever beyond a basic analyst, which tells you that his background most likely is political.
Yeah.
And as we've seen this week with the Nunes information, that may have been his job, is to go into those systems, use his clearance, get that information out, and use it for political purposes, not intelligence purposes.
And you know, Nayyera Bakos, you know, you had Eli Lake did a story in Bloomberg this week in which he said essentially Devin Nunes lied to his face when he asked him if his sources for this information were in the White House. He said he told me his source for that information was an intelligence official, not a White House staffer. It turns out he misled me. You have been personally involved in this situation where the White House wants to politicize intelligence, wants to find people who will participate in it. Do you find it suspicious, as Malcolm does, that this gentleman, Ezra Cohen-Watnick, was so insistent upon remaining in place even after Flynn was gone?
Yes, I mean, he doesn't seem like, as Malcolm said, he doesn't seem like somebody who is at that level. He doesn't have the experience in the background to be able to perform and function in that job. In addition to the fact that they're looking at raw intelligence, I think, at this point, and deciding and describing to the public and to the committee what it is that they're seeing, which raw intelligence is up to interpretation and to context. And I would say that also that, I mean, we're seeing reporting now that the president himself wants to see raw intelligence. In my experience, that never works out.
Right.
And why is that? What is it that raw intelligence, is it that it's difficult? Because it doesn't seem even that Devin Nunes understood what he was seeing. He looked at the information and thought it was a bombshell. Adam Schiff, who's the ranking member, looked at the exact same information and said he didn't see why it was even necessary to go the route that Nunes did. I'm going to go to Naveed on that. How could it be that two of these members of Congress looked at that same raw intelligence and one came to the conclusion that it was a bombshell that proved that Trump was wiretapped and the other didn't?
Well, as Nayyera said, it's up to interpretation and context, and in this case, I think both of the answer to those questions is political. You know, you essentially you had people looking at this intelligence not with the way that you're supposed to, which is look at the intelligence and see where it leads you, be objective, unbiased, and you know, produce analysis, but rather they were looking for evidence to support the president's claim that in fact President Obama had wiretapped him. And I think that, you know, again, as Nayyera and Malcolm has said in the past, you know, this is raw intelligence. It's not been validated. It could say anything, and I think that when you look at this stuff, perhaps it could be a little bit shocking. We don't know what was in there, but on the flip side, again, I think that this was all primarily motivated to look for evidence to support a claim, which is, again, that is not what you ever do. You take intelligence, you interpret it, and then you present it objectively and unbiased to a decision maker.
Yeah, and Nayyera, it does, you know, it feels like a cover-up. Certainly, it does seem that once Donald Trump tweeted that already knocked down assertion that he was wiretapped at Trump Tower, you now seem to have had at least 3 White House officials with access to that intelligence go on a fishing expedition to try and find it. In your experience, have you ever heard of something like that happening within a White House agency?
No, and these are the agencies at the NSC that are supposed to be non-political. So each of the intelligence agencies contributes personnel who are experienced so that they can help advise and give context to the president. You know, unfortunately, you have now somebody in the senior-most slot who is more interested in saving his career and working on the partisan side. Part of the challenge now we have is this idea of a story to tell. The quote from our dear friend who said that he has a story to tell.
Michael Flynn's lawyer.
Right, but it's also a witch hunt. You can't really have both at the same time, but what we do know is the President of the United States, Donald Trump, is very good at developing storylines in the public image, and that's what he does. So these are stories to detract and distract people from what is really going on, which is why there's constantly now, this all started with, you know, Donald Trump's own tweet about manipulation of information, and that, unfortunately, is what we're seeing this White House do itself, is manipulate this information. The challenge we have right now with the idea that the president now wants to move even further away from actual analysis and facts is, and use raw intelligence intelligence is the equivalent of, one of us going on WebMD and looking up information and saying, diagnosing ourselves, right? This is, you have experts and people who are trained, like doctors, like intelligence analysts, for a reason, because they have the experience and the history to be able to interpret the information in a nonpartisan way. So that's what we're seeing, is that now the intelligence agencies are being co-opted for an agenda run strictly for partisan purposes.
Yeah, and I'm going to come back to John Dean on this, because then you had, on top of that, you had Sean Spicer not only spouting conspiracy theories from the White House podium to try and deflect the media onto a new topic, he also really didn't answer the question about whether or not Donald Trump, through his Twitter account, was trying to encourage the Justice Department to immunize Michael Flynn. Let's take a listen.
He believes that Mike Flynn should go testify. He thinks that he should go up there and do what he has to do to get the story out.
With or without immunity?
Well, I mean, that's up to him and his lawyer to decide. I'm not going to give Mike Flynn or anyone else legal advice from the podium, but I will tell you that the president's view is he should go up there, he should testify.
But the president gave legal advice from his Twitter account. He said Mike
I know,
Flynn
but the
should
interesting,
ask for immunity.
right? And I understand.
He has said in the past that the only reason you ask for immunity is if you commit.
Right, but I think that the underlying point that you're missing, Jonathan, respectfully, is that what he's asking is go testify.
The propriety of the President of the United States suggesting that Mike Flynn should either get immunity or go testify.
Mr. Trump has no regard for any standard procedures, any norms, and it's really quite out of place to be suggesting what justice should or should not do.
Yeah.
I think his influence is minimal in this situation, given the fact that Attorney General Sessions has recused himself. The rest of the department is not going to be listening closely to what this advice from the White House is. So. He's making a lot of noise and having very little impact with this, but that's kind of par for the course.
Yeah, it's definitely going in only one direction, and it ain't uphill. Thank you very much, John Dean. Nayyera Haq, Bakos, and Navel Jamali. Malcolm Nance is sticking around. And coming up, our